Sir, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave the plane. The cabin fell silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Passengers froze with their coffee cups halfway to their lips. All eyes turned to the aisle, where Rebecca Lane, her uniform pristine and her presence commanding, stood over the man in seat 18C. The man, mid-40s, composed and exuding an air of quiet confidence, looked up at her. His bright red hat, boldly emblazoned with the phrase, "Make America Great Again," seemed to glow under the harsh cabin lights. "On what grounds?" he asked, his voice steady and calm, yet carrying an unmistakable edge. Rebecca's grip tightened on the service tray she held, her knuckles whitening. Her pulse raced, but her face betrayed nothing. She wasn't used to being questioned, least of all in front of a plane full of passengers. "Your hat is making other passengers uncomfortable," she said, her words crisp and deliberate. "It violates our policy against offensive behavior." The man tilted his head slightly, his expression unwavering. A faint, almost imperceptible smile played at the corners of his mouth, not mocking, but as if he'd seen this scenario play out before. "Uncomfortable?" he repeated, his voice laced with incredulity. "Or is it just that you find it uncomfortable?" Her composure faltered for a split second, a flicker of hesitation that only he seemed to notice. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, a wave of whispers spreading among the passengers. Tension hung heavy in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. "I'm giving you a choice," Rebecca said, her voice now colder, sharper. "Either remove the hat, or you'll need to leave this flight." The man sighed softly, closed the book he had been reading, and stood up. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. He retrieved his bag from the overhead bin and turned toward the aisle. "If that's what you think is necessary," he said, his voice calm but firm. The passengers watched in stunned silence as he walked down the aisle toward the exit, his posture dignified, his head held high. For Rebecca, this should have felt like a victory. But as she stared at his retreating figure, a gnawing unease began to take root. What Rebecca didn't realize was that the man she'd just removed wasn't an ordinary passenger. He was about to change her life in a way she could never have anticipated. Let's rewind to uncover how we got here. What would you do in Rebecca's position? Was she right to take a stand, or did she cross the line? Let us know what you think. If you're on Team Rebecca, comment 2. But if you think she went too far, drop a 7 in the comments. And hey, if you love thought-provoking stories that keep you guessing until the very end, make sure to subscribe to Elderly Wisdom and hit the notification bell. We've got so many more stories like this coming your way, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next in this one. To understand how the flight turned into a battleground over a red MAGA hat, we need to step back to where it all began. It was a crisp, sunny morning at Boston Logan International Airport. Passengers were shuffling onto Flight 237, their conversations blending into a low hum. Rebecca Lane, senior flight attendant, moved seamlessly through the cabin, her polished demeanor masking the tension brewing beneath. Rebecca had built a reputation as someone who didn't just follow the rules, she enforced them with precision. She had spent years perfecting her ability to diffuse conflicts and maintain control. But that morning, something felt different. The air seemed charged with an unease she couldn't quite place, and it all crystallized when she saw him. He was an unassuming man in his mid-40 seconds, dressed in a navy blazer with neatly pressed slacks. Nothing about him screamed trouble, except for the bright red hat perched confidently on his head. The stark white letters spelled out a phrase that had, over time, become a lightning rod for controversy: "Make America Great Again." Rebecca froze for a moment, her professional mask slipping ever so slightly. That hat wasn't just a fashion choice. It was a statement, one that carried echoes of her past. Growing up in a politically divided town, Rebecca had witnessed firsthand how that slogan could ignite arguments, sever relationships, and spark violence. For Rebecca, it wasn't just a hat. It was a reminder of her father, a lifelong Democrat, clashing with her uncle, a staunch conservative. Their once loving bond had disintegrated into silence after countless family arguments, all centered around politics. That hat symbolized more than division. It was a flashpoint for everything she despised about the growing rift in society. As Rebecca watched the man settle into his seat in row, her mind raced. She reminded herself that she wasn't here to judge personal beliefs. Her job was to maintain order. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hat was more than just an accessory. The murmurs began almost immediately. "Is he really wearing that?" someone whispered 2 rows back. "Does he not realize how offensive that is to some people?" another passenger muttered. Rebecca tried to focus on her pre-flight tasks, but the comments buzzed in her ears like static. Her sense of duty clashed with the principles she held so tightly. She glanced toward her junior colleague, Sarah Nguyen, who had caught the situation as well. Sarah raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable, but didn't say a word. For a moment, Rebecca considered letting it go. After all, the man hadn't done anything disruptive. He wasn't loud or rude. He was quietly reading a book, seemingly oblivious to the storm his hat was stirring. But as Rebecca moved down the aisle, handing out pre-flight refreshments, her eyes kept drifting back to him. The red of the hat felt like a siren, screaming for her attention. By the time all the passengers were seated, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Rebecca's instincts told her she needed to act, not just for her own peace of mind, but to prevent the unease from boiling over. She approached the man's row, her steps purposeful. The murmurs around her hushed as passengers realized she was heading straight for him. Standing tall, Rebecca leaned slightly toward him. "Sir," she began, her voice calm but firm, "may I have a word with you?" The man looked up from his book, his gaze steady and unbothered. He didn't seem surprised. In fact, it felt as though he'd been expecting this. "Of course," he said simply, setting his book down. Rebecca straightened, her hands clasped in front of her. "Your hat is drawing attention from other passengers," she said carefully. "Some of them have expressed discomfort, and I'd like to ask you to consider removing it for the duration of the flight." The man tilted his head, his expression calm but curious. "Discomfort," he repeated. "From a hat?" Rebecca held his gaze, her professional demeanor unwavering. "It's not about the hat itself, sir. It's about what it represents. We aim to create a safe and welcoming environment for all passengers." He smiled faintly, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And you think removing my hat will accomplish that?" Rebecca's jaw tightened. She could feel the weight of every passenger's eyes on her, waiting to see how she would handle the situation. "Sir, I'm asking you as a courtesy," she said, her tone hardening. "If you choose not to comply, I may have to escalate this further." The man sat back, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Escalate?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "All because I'm wearing a red hat?" Rebecca's pulse quickened. She knew this was her moment to stand firm. "This is your final warning," she said, her voice carrying through the cabin. "If you choose not to comply, I'll have no choice but to ask you to leave the plane." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, passengers exchanging wide-eyed glances. The man didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, retrieved his bag from the overhead bin, and turned to Rebecca. "If that's what you think is best," he said calmly, his tone neither bitter nor apologetic. Rebecca stepped aside as he walked down the aisle, his red hat still perched on his head. The silence in the cabin was deafening as passengers watched him leave. As the cabin door closed and the plane began to taxi, Rebecca returned to her duties, her head held high. She told herself she'd done the right thing, that she'd acted to protect the comfort and safety of everyone on board. But deep down, a nagging doubt lingered. Did she make the right call, or had she let her own bias cloud her judgment? Little did she know, the man in the red hat wasn't just an ordinary passenger, and what came next would turn her world upside down. The plane touched down in Los Angeles smoothly, but Rebecca's nerves were anything but steady. For the rest of the flight, she had carried out her duties with mechanical precision, avoiding the questioning glances from some passengers and the occasional murmurs about the guy in the red hat As passengers disembarked, Rebecca stood at the front of the cabin, her smile polished but distant. She had convinced herself that she had done the right thing. The man's hat was provocative, a potential catalyst for conflict, and she had diffused the situation before it escalated. Or so she thought. But when the last passenger exited and Rebecca turned to retrieve her bag, she noticed two men in suits waiting just outside the jet bridge. Their posture was formal, their expressions unreadable. One of them, tall and sharply dressed, stepped forward. "Miss Lane," he said, his voice cool and professional. "We need to speak with you. Please follow us." Rebecca's chest tightened. "Is there a problem?" she asked, keeping her tone steady. The man didn't answer, only gestured toward the terminal. Rebecca hesitated, glancing back at her crew, who were busy tidying the cabin. With a nod, she followed the men into the airport, her mind racing. They led her into a private conference room tucked away from the bustling terminal. The room was stark, with a long table and a few chairs under bright fluorescent lights. Seated at the head of the table was another man, older, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit. His presence exuded authority. "Miss Lane," the man said, gesturing for her to sit. "I'm Mark Preston, Chief Operating Officer of Crosswave Airlines." Rebecca's stomach sank. The CEO, why was he here? Mark didn't waste time. "Do you know the passenger you removed from this flight?" he asked, his tone sharp but measured. Rebecca's mind raced. "He was disruptive," she said quickly, her voice defensive. "Several passengers expressed discomfort over his choice of attire. I acted in accordance with our policy to ensure a safe and comfortable environment." Mark leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "And did you at any point stop to consider who that passenger was?" Rebecca blinked, confused. I didn't need to. He was..." "Jacob Randall," Mark interrupted, his voice like steel. "The CEO and primary shareholder of this airline." The words hit her like a thunderclap. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. "Wait," she whispered, barely able to form the word. "The CEO?" Mark's expression didn't soften. "Yes, the man you publicly humiliated and removed from the flight is the owner of this company. And now, Miss Lane, he has personally requested to speak with you." Rebecca's heart sank into her stomach. The room seemed to close in around her. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. "I'll warn you now," Mark continued, his tone colder. "This is not a conversation you can afford to take lightly. Mr. Randall values respect above all else, and what you did today was anything but respectful." Rebecca nodded mutely, unable to find her voice. "Follow me," Mark said, standing and gesturing toward the door. "He's waiting for you." Rebecca rose on shaky legs, her pulse pounding in her ears. As she followed Mark through the maze of hallways, her mind raced with regret and desperation. She thought back to the man in the red hat, his calm demeanor, his deliberate words. She had seen him as a symbol, not a person. And now, that mistake was about to cost her everything. The door to the conference room opened, revealing a sleek glass-walled office overlooking the bustling airport below. Jacob Randall stood by the window, his back to the door. He turned as Rebecca entered, his expression unreadable, but his presence commanding. "Miss Lane," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Please, have a seat." Rebecca swallowed hard, lowering herself into the chair across from him. The silence was deafening as Jacob studied her, his gaze steady and unyielding. Finally he spoke. "Do you know why I sometimes choose to fly economy?" he asked. Rebecca shook her head, unsure how to respond. "It's because I want to understand how my passengers are treated," he said simply. "Not by corporate policies or training manuals, but by the people who represent this company on the front lines." His words hung in the air like a verdict. "What I experienced today," he continued, his tone sharpening, "was not professionalism. It was judgment, assumption, and a blatant disregard for the values this company stands for." Rebecca's throat tightened. "Mr. Randall, I thought I was acting in the best interest of the passengers." Jacob raised a hand, cutting her off. "You didn't think," he said firmly. "You reacted. You let your personal biases cloud your judgment, and in doing so, you jeopardized not only my trust in you, but also the reputation of this airline." Rebecca felt the weight of his words pressing down on her. She wanted to defend herself, to explain, but she knew he was right. "Here's what's going to happen," Jacob said, his tone softening but still firm. "You have two choices. You can resign today, effective immediately, or you can undergo a rigorous retraining program focusing on professionalism, emotional intelligence, and conflict resolution. But let me be clear, there will be no second chances." Rebecca's hands trembled in her lap. Resign? Give up the career she had worked so hard for? Or face the humiliation of retraining, knowing she would be under constant scrutiny? "I'll take the training," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. Then we're done here." As Rebecca stood to leave, Jacob spoke one last time. "Ms. Lane," he said, his tone softer but still commanding. "The next time you see someone wearing a red hat or anything else you don't agree with, remember this moment. And ask yourself whether your judgment is worth the cost." Rebecca nodded, her face burning with shame, and walked out of the office. As she stepped into the terminal, the weight of her actions settled over her. She had been so certain she was doing the right thing, but now all she could feel was regret. This wasn't the end of Rebecca Lane's story, but it was a turning point, a moment she would never forget, a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Rebecca left Jacob Randall's office feeling as though the world was pressing down on her shoulders. The bustling terminal felt distant, muffled, as if she were walking underwater. Every step she took seemed heavier than the last. Passengers streamed past her, oblivious to the inner turmoil of the flight attendant who had once ruled her cabin with confidence. She slipped into the staff lounge, hoping for a moment to collect herself. But the whispers started the moment she stepped through the door. Her colleagues, gathered in small clusters, glanced at her with a mix of curiosity and unease. The news of her confrontation with the CEO had traveled fast, faster than she expected. "Rebecca," Sarah Nguyen called gently, breaking away from the group. Her voice was kind, but her eyes betrayed concern. "Are you okay?" Rebecca nodded stiffly. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Sarah hesitated, then lowered her voice. "We heard. About Mr. Randall, what happened?" Rebecca sighed, sinking into a chair. "He gave me a choice," she admitted, her tone hollow. "Resign or take retraining." Sarah frowned, sympathy flickering across her face. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "That must have been intense." "It was," Rebecca said, leaning back and closing her eyes. "But it's my fault. I let my emotions get the best of me. I let that hat—" She stopped, shaking her head. "I let what it represented cloud my judgment." Sarah sat beside her, choosing her words carefully. "You know, Rebecca, I think this could be a chance for you to grow, to see things differently. I know it doesn't feel that way now, but maybe this is what you need." Rebecca wanted to argue, to push back against Sarah's optimism, but she couldn't find the energy. Deep down, she knew her colleague was right. Rebecca didn't have much time to dwell on her feelings. The retraining program Jacob Randall had mandated began almost immediately. It was grueling, designed to push her limits and challenge her deeply held beliefs. One of the first exercises was a role-playing scenario. Rebecca was placed in a simulated cabin setting where passengers with conflicting demands forced her to juggle professionalism and empathy. "Ms. Lane," the instructor said, a stern woman named Linda Patel, "you're not here to prove you're right. You're here to understand why people think and feel the way they do. Start there." Rebecca struggled. It wasn't natural for her to pause and reflect in the heat of the moment, but as the days turned into weeks, she began to see the value in Linda's lessons. Slowly, she learned to set aside her own biases, to approach situations with curiosity rather than judgment. One day, during a group discussion, Linda posed a question that struck Rebecca to her core. What do you think that passenger, Mr. Randall, felt in that moment when you confronted him? Did you give him a chance to explain himself? Rebecca hesitated, the weight of Linda's words sinking in. She thought back to Jacob's calm, steady demeanor and the quiet dignity with which he had left the plane. She hadn't seen him as a person, just as a symbol, a trigger for her own unresolved emotions. No, Rebecca admitted, her voice soft. I didn't. I assumed I knew everything about him because of a hat. Linda nodded, her expression gentle but firm. That's where professionalism begins, recognizing the humanity in others, even when you disagree with them, especially then. As the program progressed, Rebecca began to reflect on her own life. She thought about her father and uncle, how their once close bond had been shattered by political differences. She remembered how she had always sided with her father, how she had allowed her uncle's conservative views to define him in her eyes. One evening, as she sat in her small apartment, Rebecca picked up the phone. Her fingers hovered over the keypad before she dialed a number she hadn't used in years. "Uncle Tom?" she said, when the line connected. There was a pause, then a gruff voice answered. "Rebecca, is that you?" "Yes," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's me. I was just thinking about you, about everything. I wanted to say I'm sorry. I think I've been unfair to you." The silence on the other end was deafening. Finally, her uncle spoke, his tone softer than she remembered. "Rebecca, you don't know how much it means to hear that." The conversation was awkward at first, but as the minutes ticked by, the walls between them began to crumble. For the first time in years, Rebecca felt a glimmer of hope that their family could heal. Rebecca's final test in the retraining program was a live flight simulation. The instructors threw every possible challenge at her: angry passengers, miscommunications among the crew, and unexpected emergencies. Through it all, Rebecca remained calm, patient, and professional. When the simulation ended, Linda Patel approached her with a small smile. "You've come a long way, Rebecca," she said. "I think you're ready to get back in the air." Rebecca's heart swelled with relief and gratitude. She had been given a second chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. On her first flight after completing the program, Rebecca stood at the front of the cabin, greeting passengers as they boarded. Her heart raced as she spotted a man in his mid-40 seconds wearing a bright red hat. "Make America Great Again." This time she didn't freeze. She didn't judge. Instead, she smiled warmly. "Welcome aboard," she said, her voice steady and sincere. The man smiled back. "Thank you," he said, taking his seat. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Rebecca glanced down the aisle, her confidence returning. She had learned a valuable lesson. The skies weren't just a place for people to travel, they were a place for people to come together, no matter their differences. Little did she know Jacob Randall was watching from first class, a faint smile on his lips. He nodded approvingly. She had passed the test. Rebecca Lane was back where she belonged, flying high, with a new understanding of what it truly meant to lead. Rebecca's return to the skies wasn't just about resuming her role, it was about proving she had changed. On her first flight after retraining, she felt both excitement and nerves. She knew passengers wouldn't know her story, but she carried the weight of her lessons with her like a shield. The flight from New York to Denver started smoothly. Passengers filed in, chatting about their destinations and stowing bags, while Rebecca guided them with ease. She smiled genuinely, not just because it was part of her job, but because she finally felt a deeper connection to the people she served. Then it happened. Halfway through boarding, a man stepped onto the plane, dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt. Perched on his head was a bright red hat with bold white letters, "Make America Great Again." For a brief moment, Rebecca felt her stomach twist. It was an almost instinctive reaction, but she took a deep breath, grounding herself in the lessons she had worked so hard to learn. "Welcome aboard, sir," she said warmly, meeting his gaze with a smile that held no judgment. "Thank you," the man replied, tipping his hat slightly, before heading to his seat in row 12. Rebecca exhaled, feeling a mix of pride and relief. She had faced the symbol again, and this time she had treated it as just that, a hat. As the flight progressed, Rebecca walked through the cabin, checking on passengers. When she reached row 12, the man with the red hat caught her eye. "Excuse me," he said, his voice friendly. "Can I get a water when you have a chance?" "Of course," Rebecca said, nodding. She returned moments later with the bottle, handing it to him. To her surprise, he looked up and said, "You have a great crew. I fly a lot, and not every flight has this kind of service." Rebecca smiled. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." He nodded, then leaned in slightly. "You know, a lot of people look at this hat and think they know everything about me," he said, tapping the brim. "But it's just a hat. The real story's always more complicated, don't you think?" Rebecca paused, his words hitting closer to home than he could have realized. "You're absolutely right," she said. "It's easy to assume, but the truth usually takes more time to understand." He smiled, seemingly satisfied with her response, and leaned back into his seat. Later, as the flight neared its destination, Rebecca noticed a familiar face stepping out of the first-class cabin. Jacob Randall was there again, walking toward her with the same calm, composed expression she remembered from their first meeting. "Ms. Lane," he said softly, stopping beside her near the galley. Rebecca straightened, feeling a mixture of pride and nervousness. "Mr. Randall," she replied. He glanced down the aisle toward the man in the red hat, then back at Rebecca. "I wanted to see how you'd handle your first flight back," he said. "And?" she asked, her voice steady. Jacob's lips curved into a faint smile. "You've come a long way," he said. "I'm impressed." Rebecca felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over her. "Thank you," she said. "I've learned a lot these past few weeks." Jacob nodded. "Good. Because being a leader isn't about being perfect. It's about learning, adapting, and treating people with respect, even when it's difficult." He stepped back, his gaze softening. "Welcome back to the skies, Ms. Lane. I'm glad to have you aboard again." Rebecca watched as he returned to first class, her chest swelling with a sense of accomplishment. As the plane landed smoothly in Denver, Rebecca stood at the front, bidding farewell to the passengers as they disembarked. When the man in the red hat reached her, he paused, meeting her gaze. "You've got a great attitude," he said, extending a hand. "Thank you for making this flight a good one." Rebecca shook his hand firmly, her smile genuine. "Thank you for flying with us. Have a great day." As the man disappeared into the terminal, Rebecca realized that this flight wasn't just about her career, it was about redemption, growth, and the simple yet profound act of seeing people for who they truly were. Rebecca Lane was no longer just a flight attendant. She was a symbol of what it meant to rise above judgment, to learn from mistakes, and to embrace the infinite complexities of the people around her. And somewhere in first class, Jacob Randall smiled to himself. The skies were in good hands again. Rebecca Lane's return to the skies marked more than just the resumption of her career. It became the foundation of a transformation she hadn't realized she needed. Each flight felt like a test, an opportunity to prove she had learned to let go of her own biases and embrace the diversity of people she encountered. But her journey of growth wasn't limited to the cabin. It extended beyond the flights into her personal life. One evening, Rebecca sat in her modest apartment staring at her phone. Her Uncle Tom's number was still saved, the digits etched in her memory. Their recent conversation had been a turning point, but she knew it was only the beginning. With a deep breath, she dialed the number again. "Rebecca," Tom answered after the first ring, his voice warm but cautious. "Hi, Uncle Tom," she said, her voice steady. "I was wondering if we could meet. It's been too long, and there are things I'd really like to talk about, face to face." There was a pause, then a soft chuckle. "I'd like that too. How about Sunday dinner? Your aunt's been wanting to see you." Rebecca smiled, a wave of relief washing over her. "Sunday sounds perfect." That Sunday evening, as she pulled into her uncle's driveway, memories of her childhood came flooding back. The house was exactly as she remembered. its familiar charm now tinged with the hope of reconciliation. Tom greeted her at the door, his embrace warm and genuine. Over dinner, they spoke of old times, the rift between them easing with every shared memory. "You know," Tom said, his voice thoughtful, "I always thought you were one of the few people in the family who could bridge the divide. You've got this ability to understand people, even when they're different from you." Rebecca blinked, his words striking a chord. "I guess I forgot that for a while," she admitted, "but I'm trying to remember now." Rebecca's professional growth paralleled her personal journey. On board her flights, she began to see passengers not as strangers, but as individuals with unique stories. Every interaction became an opportunity to practice empathy, to connect in small but meaningful ways. One day, during a layover in Chicago, Rebecca found herself in a coffee shop, scrolling through her emails. Among the usual corporate updates was a message from Jacob Randall's office. Rebecca hesitated, her heart racing as she opened the email. "Dear Ms. Lane, I wanted to personally commend you on your recent performance. Your actions during your retraining and your first flights back have set a standard of professionalism and compassion that aligns perfectly with the values of Crosswave Airlines. It's not easy to confront personal growth, and it's even harder to apply those lessons under pressure. But you've done exactly that. I look forward to seeing your continued contributions to our company. Best regards, Jacob Randall, CEO, Crosswave Airlines." Rebecca read the email twice, her chest swelling with a mix of pride and humility. She had come a long way, but she knew her journey was far from over. On a crisp autumn morning, Rebecca stepped onto a new flight, the sun casting a golden glow through the airport windows. As passengers boarded, she greeted them with a renewed sense of purpose. "Good morning. Welcome aboard." One passenger, a young woman with a nervous expression, hesitated as she reached Rebecca. "It's my first time flying," the woman confessed, her voice trembling. Rebecca's smile softened. "Don't worry," she said gently. "You're in good hands. If you need anything, just let me know." Throughout the flight, Rebecca checked on the woman, offering reassurances and small gestures of kindness. By the time they landed, the woman's face had transformed into one of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she said as she disembarked. "You made this so much easier for me." Rebecca watched her leave, a quiet sense of fulfillment settling over her. She had once seen her job as enforcing order, but now she understood it was about creating connection. Rebecca's story began with a moment of judgment, a decision rooted in her past. But through the turbulence, she found clarity. She learned that every passenger, every interaction, was a chance to rise above assumptions and truly see the person in front of her. As the weeks turned into months, Rebecca's confidence grew, not from authority, but from understanding. She had become more than a flight attendant. She had become a bridge, a symbol of how people could overcome their differences and find common ground. And somewhere high above the clouds, Jacob Randall kept an eye on her progress, knowing the skies were safer, kinder, and brighter because Rebecca Lane had earned her wings back. What do you think of Rebecca's journey? Have you ever faced a moment where you had to confront your own biases and grow from it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit subscribe to Elderly Wisdom and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another tale of transformation. The next story might just change the way you see the world.